party hand clasp, there we go.
Well, good evening.
Evening.
I am, and I know that Rev Steve and Dr. Howell, I just give him a promotion, are happy to see everybody here. 246th anniversary of the alarm and of the order that was given to seize the powder in Concord, among other places. What I want to do, obviously in keeping with the sentiments, and I think it's an important part of the story, and quite often people don't really understand it because this part of it isn't talked about too often. And it was definitely something that was on their minds. So what I want to do is, in keeping with the day, I want to start out with scripture. You may or may not have to follow along, that is fine, but I want to read it to you, and it's out of 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'm going to start with verse 5. And said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Make us now a king to judge us like all nations.
Amen.
But the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, Give us a king to judge us, and Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And then the Lord said unto Samuel, Hear the voice of the people, and all that they shall say unto thee, for they have not cast thee away, but they have cast me away, that I should not reign over them. I'm going to skip to verse 9. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet testify unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. At this point we were at what was known as the Republic of Israel, the end of the Judges. Probably one of the most successful parts of Israeli history, ancient Israel, Hebrew history, when they get into the kings. And as we can see now, that first of the kings is going to be King Saul, and we know how that developed, even with David and Solomon, and therefore all the kings of Judah after and Israel. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked the king of them. And he said, This shall be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He shall take your sons and appoint over them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariot. Also, he will make them his captains over thousands, and captains over 50s, and to ear to the ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make instruments of war, and the things that serve his chariots. He will also take your daughters and make them apothecaries, cooks, and bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards, and your best olive trees, and give them to his servants.
Amen.
He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give it to his eunuchs and to his servants. He will take your manservants and your maidservants, and the chief of your young men and your asses, and put them to work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out at that day because of your king, whom you have chosen, and the Lord will not hear you at that day. As it will go on to say, the people did not obey Samuel or the Lord. And they said instead, verse 20, And we will be like all other nations, and our king shall judge us, and go out before us and fight our battles. It is not only a message for today, it was a message for 1775. How often are we told that? Almost never. People wonder, what was the problem with King George III? Well, Samuel 8 describes it perfectly, but it doesn't start and end with George III, folks. What was in the minds of these people living within a few rods of us was what happened over in England with the great Magna Carta, when they had to bring another king, probably the worst in English history, John I, John the Only, where he was forced to sign Charter of Liberties. And they were Charter of Liberties, despite what progressives will tell you today. Then it manifested itself in wars between those who wanted the country rule, the popular rule in Parliament, against the powers of the monarchy and the king, culminating in the Great English Civil War, which many people here took part in, and in the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s, which was still fresh in the minds of people here when the colonial charters in New England, New York, and New Jersey were stolen and taken away, with one exception that was hidden in Connecticut, but they still ruled over the same way. That is what happened in 1775. It wasn't some vacuum where somebody just woke up one day and said, you know what, we just had it with this British Empire arrangement. It's just not going to work. Had nothing to do with it. It was because of the manner of how kings had been, especially when they ruled like tyrants, because how many kings obeyed the law? All of them were supposed to. but very few have, and we've seen this in Scripture, and we saw it here with George III. Essentially what had happened, when George III had become king in 1760, it was at the death of his grandfather, King George II. King George II, fairly wise man, he was the last king to be in battle, at the Battle of Dettingen, and he also oversaw the final war of his life, which was the 7 Years' War. And they had a strange family relationship in the Hanoverian dynasty. Fathers and sons hated each other. So when his son and George's father died, that hatred just kind of channels to them. So 22-year-old George III takes over, and he tries to dismantle everything his grandfather had done. It wasn't a lot, but there were a few things he had done. And at that point, there were two factions in England. That's another subject for another day, but the Whig faction were the ones that supported parliamentary rights, very sympathetic to what was happening here in the colonies, and you had the Tories, who favored the divine right of kings, in contravention to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And that's how he started to rule. All of the Tories who had been out of power for 3 generations now started swarming back. They had to be careful, because if he tried to get absolute authority in England and in Great Britain, he could lose his head, and he knew that. His first moves were in England. They weren't here in America. Who was one of the men that sounded the alarm bell here as he was going back and forth? Anybody familiar with the name George Whitfield?
Yeah, he was a preacher.
Certainly was. He was one of the main preachers of what became the Great Awakening. And he actually died in Newburyport, still buried here, a few years before the war broke out. And there were other men that had warned, they're coming. Why were they coming for New England? Well, we've heard about that pesky group of folks who had ruled England for a time, and certainly New England, called Puritans. And the reason they were pesky was because they got into the way of the plans of some people who thought that they should rule in a way that many of the Israelis wanted to rule in 1 Samuel, verse 8. And because New England happened to be still the epicenter for that way of thought, they believed in their Bible. The main Bible at the time was still the Geneva Bible that came over with the separatist pilgrims back in 1620. Like before in the other fights they had with king and parliament, they said, if we're going to bring this to heel, we need to start this here. So they did. Adam Smith wrote his Wealth of Nations. Anybody, I'm sure most people here are familiar with Adam Smith, have heard his name. One of the greatest economists, certainly in the modern era, if not in, period. And Adam Smith wrote something very interesting in his Wealth of Nations, because it was published in 1776. In that book, he had written that, I'm just going to borrow this one. Gives me a little bit of theater. He had written that the American colonies were not just the fastest growing part of the British Empire, they were the fastest growing part of the world economically. He also wrote, and this is in 1774, 75, that if things kept going the way they were going to go, the future capital of the British Empire may not be in London, it may end up in Philadelphia. If you are a Tory, member of the House of Lords, King George III, and you're seeing this, or even reading it, what are you starting to think? Huh?
Problem.
He had thrown a man named John Wilkes in the Tower of London. It caused a riot in London. John Wilkes was one of the leading Whigs in England at that time and a big friend to the colonies. An interesting fellow, but when it came to the rule of law, he was very good. And it started to backfire. So what did they do? They started coming here. If they were going to have their long-range plans of taking over, first of all, they had to arrest what was here, so that wouldn't become the fastest growing part of the empire. And they could slowly but surely work their way into the British Isles, and he could avoid the fate of his Stuart ancestor, Charles I, who was beheaded. So that's what brought us to where we are. That tells us the why. What would happen? Because the relationship between the colonies and Britain was a fairly decent one. Wasn't always perfect, but they had the colonial legislators. They met, and there was no problem with it. There were a couple of incidents here and there where there were some problems, but nothing huge. Now all of a sudden, what does George III and his ministers do? Well, first thing he does is he starts dusting off laws going all the way back to Henry VIII. Anybody remember the year Henry VIII ruled?
Early 1500s,
Yeah.
1520s, 30s.
Mid to late 1500s. And he was the son of Henry VII, who had ended the War of the Roses in the late 1400s, to give you an idea how far back that goes. And one of the things that was on the laws of Henry VIII were that if you were going to be tried for a crime, you had to face a trial in England. Now, of course, back then England didn't have colonies. But if you were in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, they could bring you in. And that law had not been followed because if somebody committed a crime here, they were tried here. Now all of a sudden, we're going to make you go back to England? Trial the jury by your peers? Violates a few sections. Now, British had a constitution, by the way. And understand when I use the term British, people thought they had to break a few myths about what the term meant, and they created other worse myths in between. People in England did not refer to themselves as British. That doesn't happen until after Napoleon Bonaparte comes around. They refer to themselves as Englishmen, Welshmen, Scotsmen, although some Scotsmen called themselves North Britons because they had a couple of Jacobite rebellions which were not completely Scottish, but because they were in the Highlands they felt a little bit uneasy because they supported those. And you had Irishmen. People here in the colonies would refer to themselves by where they lived in their colonies. Oh yeah, somebody call themselves Englishmen here and there, but for the most part, especially in England, you're talking multi-generations removed from England. You're talking 155 years. In Virginia, you're talking 165, 170 years in some cases. So, that's where we are. What else starts to happen during this period of time? Well, myth number 2, the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War, created so much debt that the ungrateful colonies just did not want to pay it off. Let's put this one to rest, folks. Surprise or surprises, some of the things we've been told are not exactly accurate. So, 7 Years' War, French-Indian War, started here. Actually started with a young officer of a Virginia provincial company named George Washington. He didn't start it, the Frenchmen did, but he was there and held responsible by the French for it. Made him a big name too, by the way. And at the end of the war, a couple things had happened. We conquered French in Canada, which is a big deal. I mean, there are huge numbers of raids over the years that came from Canada that were considered a big threat, and they were. And they wanted to conquer New England, never were able to, obviously, because of the numbers. But a large part of that was also accomplished with American blood. During part of the war, Spain comes in toward the end, and British regular forces are sent to Cuba. However, as we learn a couple hundred years later after that, or 150 years later, there's something called malaria from mosquito bites, and it started decimating the British soldiers. So what do? They bring in colonial regiments, largely from New England, but a lot of them from Middle States and Virginia, and they go down and they capture Havana. Americans served in the regular Royal Army, regular Royal Navy, so it wasn't anything where they were just coming over and taking care of things for us. And a lot of blood and treasure came out. Probably the worst thing that happened out of the colonies, a lot of the Quakers in the Philadelphia Assembly for Pennsylvania didn't want to put in their quota, and Ben Franklin, among other people, had chastised them. So that was the one thing, but they ended up having to pay eventually. So this debt was used as an excuse to start levying taxes. Now, you talk about the taxes, okay, you know, we hear the same thing today. This hasn't changed. What's a few cents? What's a few dollars? I mean, yeah, come on, you hardly even feel it, especially if you're rich like we are. You just don't even feel it. Well, let me tell you what it did. It created a precedent. When they started increasing those taxes, they started putting stamps, that's the Stamp Act, where you had to put stamps on things and that cost money. What they did was twofold. Not only did it create a precedent where you could have George and his ministers and his Tory party just unilaterally create a revenue stream, that revenue stream was altered. It was altered because up until now, colonial assemblies had paid their own judges, their own customs officials to enforce the laws, and some of the other officers that were answerable to colonial governors. Now all of a sudden, they were directly answerable to George III and his ministers. So when they go to collect those taxes, what do you suppose is going to happen? Oh yeah, I'll give you an abatement on that, sure. That's what started the ball rolling. Not too far, I don't know, maybe a half-hour drive to the old State House, a man by the name of James Otis had argued, using old Magna Carta, against the writs of assistance, searches and seizures, because they would actually search and seize to get the things, because they were supposedly not allowed. Smuggling, myth number whatever, and I think I'm on 4, at least. John Hancock, we're told John was a smuggler. Goes unanswered, John Hancock was a smuggler. Most people don't know, so they go along with it. Not all the time, but you know, you hear it. Why was John Hancock and others considered smugglers? Well, you could trade anywhere around the world. And again, trade out of the American colonies was huge. You had a lot of ships going back and forth. All of a sudden, with the Navigation Acts that were dusted off from the 1660s, they said, oh, by the way, you Americans and other colonies, you're going to have to go ship your goods to the mother country. And then you can ship them out. You know, they'll be shipped out. You can't directly trade with Holland anymore. What was the legal basis? Nothing. But they did it. And it upset a lot. And they said, you know what? You have no right to do this. We're going to continue to trade with who we want to trade with. And that's where the trouble started. So, now you're seeing what is happening. Leading up to the Great Boston Tea Party. They put a tax on tea. Ah, it wasn't that big a tax. Oh yeah? Well, think about this. A lot of people didn't drink it, sure. They repealed all the taxes on what was called the Townsend Acts. They pulled a fast one. And they said, okay, we're going to repeal. Now, there were some ministries in England at that time that miraculously got in there. They were able to do some good things, but they weren't there very long before they got swept away. The early 1770s, Lower North Ministry comes in, and that's where the damage is done. They said, okay, we're repealing all of them except the tea tax. So now they still have maintained the right to tax. So it looks like they retreated, but they hadn't. Great to see. What did they do? Well, that tea tax helps go to pay those customs officers. And this was up and down the seaboard, by the way, not just in Boston, but Boston's where it really blew up. The men that were in those bottoms, those ships, they were American ships. They didn't want to unload the tea. But they were told that if they didn't unload the tea, Admiral Molyneux in Boston Harbor was going to blow them out of the water when they started passing Castle William. A British ship blowing a peaceful provincial ship out of the water. For what? That was the kind of threat they were facing. And that's why that tea got dumped. And by the way, when they dumped the tea, the ship's captains gave them the keys to the locks. The crews joined in, helping them out, and they made sure nothing else was damaged. Because there was a lot of expensive goods in those ships. So not only were they going to get blown out of the water, people were going to lose out a lot of money who were innocent. They didn't want to see that happen. Of course, what did that lead to? The port of Boston being shut down. And then, when that didn't seem to work, they outlawed town meeting in all of Massachusetts. For those of us that live, how many people live in a New England town where you still have town meeting? All right? It's the last direct representation democracy form of government we have. It's what all happened all over New England. In Massachusetts, they outlawed it, setting another precedent. Now, early 1770s, what happens? It's not a question of if now, it's a question of when something's going to blow. There is great precedent, as we discovered, for fighting for your rights, even against a king in England. And they had to revamp their militia systems. In 1774, they did that with the Worcester Act. They put together what was called the Minutemen Act, where a quarter of your militia was set aside. You're either your veteran officers or your young strong men who knew how to fight, because you're going to have a problem we're going to see later on with that. And they trained for a year. British could see this little army developing here, particularly in Massachusetts, but elsewhere. This was going all up and down the seaboard, all the way down to Georgia. They were putting this in effect, but Massachusetts primarily. Now, they're trying to avoid this. But the ministry doesn't want to give up the power. They think they have the trump cards, and that's what they do. So, 1775, they have to come to a decision. Lord Dartmouth, Secretary of State for the Colonies, issues an order from the king and his ministers, he's one of them, to seize all the powder in the eastern seaboard. One of the biggest depots is in that direction in Concord. Concord becomes the center of Massachusetts government. It's been in Salem for a bit, now it's in Concord. And that's where the stores are being held. What legal right does the king have? None. But why are they doing it? They can't enforce their edicts with these militias now. So that's where we start. During this period of time, there was a group of people called committees of correspondence. You're familiar with the term, I'm sure most people here probably are. These were men in communities, towns, states, who would write back and forth, let them know what was happening. What are you doing to comply? These people understand. They weren't looking to turn anything upside down. They were looking to maintain what they had. They had developed something here, English common law. They wanted that, and they wanted to maintain it. So they wanted to make sure they did it uniformly, and that's what they would do. So when something was happening in Massachusetts, believe it or not, they heard about it in Georgia. Part of the reason they heard about it in Georgia is there was an enterprising gentleman who lived in Boston, one of the Sons of Liberty, and that's a whole other story how they came about. His name was Paul Revere. Paul was a silversmith, good friends with the doctor, famous doctor in Boston, Joseph Warren. And interesting story, Paul Revere was also, because he was a silversmith, he was also a dentist. That's where he served as a dentist for a while. And he had set Joe Warren's teeth. And when Paul Revere had smallpox, Joe Warren treated and cured him of it. As best as you can cure somebody with smallpox, but got him through it. Joseph Warren now is the in charge president of the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly. Why is he in charge? Because you had a Continental Congress that was being convened. The first one in the early 1773-74 down in Philadelphia, and now in 1775, the second one was being convened. So, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, many others, were all of a sudden leaving. So Joe Warren becomes the senior man left. Big responsibility. He discovers these plans through a spy network that we're still not clear about today, but there's some theories, we can talk about it if you have questions later. And he had discovered that the British forces that had been in Boston since 1768, because they occupied it, that was part of the closing of the port and such, we're going to march out, take the powder. Also, down the street in that direction, heading out to Bedford, is the Hancock Clark House Parsonage. We're going to talk about those men in a minute. Jonas Clark, who was really, like many of the Black Robe Regiment, like many of the ministers, they were the actual leaders of those communities. They were the ones, like you heard this morning, you know, speaking the word, preaching the word of God. That's what really bound these men together. That's the missing part of the story people don't get. Then it makes sense. William Emerson was doing the same thing in Concord. They were all up and down the seaboard, all over Massachusetts. Jonas Clark had taken over the pastorate 2 years after the death of the first minister, John Hancock, who was John Hancock's grandfather. And he ended up marrying Hancock's cousin, who lived in the next town over in Bedford, and they were staying at that house. And it was well known at this point that amnesty was being offered. Oh, by the way, the governor of Massachusetts is no longer elected or even appointed. It's General William Gage, who was also the British commander-in-chief of the Army in North America. So that's who was the governor of Massachusetts. No town meeting, getting taxed out of your livelihood. You have British soldiers quartering in Boston, where you have to, by the way, the Quartering Act. Somebody is in your house, in your barn, and a British officer comes to see you, you have to put him up, his staff up, any soldiers, any animals, and you have to pay for their upkeep. They don't pay a word. They don't pay a cent, a farthing. So that's what's going on here. So, Paul Revere had set up an alarm system. He had writers in his network that would go all the way to Georgia. Now, he didn't set up everyone in every one of the colonies, but he helped do that, and his writers would dispatch, and they would spread the word among their respective colonies. And he did it in Massachusetts. The first encounter with British troops was not here. It was in Salem in February. Remember I told you Salem was the original spot after Boston where they had convened and they had stores. British colonel was sent with only 500 men. Well, after what you see here, it doesn't seem like very many, maybe 600, to go to Salem. They go on a Sunday morning. Why did they go on a Sunday morning? We talked about this morning.
Everyone's in church.
They were at church. And were they in church for 45 minutes? No.
All day.
They were there for like many hours. So what better time? Your militia's not going to be out. Well, Revere Spy Network finds out that they're heading up there. He sends his riders up. They get to the service. I think they're in there a couple hours. The entire militia comes out. They face off against these men. There's a drawbridge at that point. There's a concrete bridge in the same spot today. And the colonel is supposed to march over, grab the cannon, march back. Now he is facing almost parity his numbers. The boats he wanted to use, well, the Patriots got to him first and stove him in. There was a free black man there, by the way, who was stoving in that last boat. British soldier jumps in, bayonets him, takes the man's gun, and he knocks him over the head. Probably the first blood of the fight in the American Revolution. The American wins. And then all of a sudden, Leslie's in trouble. The minister comes out, and he says, okay, we're going to have fighting here. Leslie said, sir, my orders are to cross that bridge. He said, fine. You may cross the bridge. We'll lower the drawbridge. When you cross that bridge, you're going to countermarch them in, which means they turn around and come back in linear formation, and you march them out again. Leslie has no choice. He leaves. Today, that is known as Leslie's Retreat, that area. There's a restaurant named Leslie's Retreat. Really good one, actually. It's a good breakfast restaurant. But that's where it almost started. So when things happened here in Lexington, it wasn't, oh my God, I can't believe they're going to try something. However, they hadn't gone this far yet. Now, Revere's out. What he does is he sets up his alarm system. He does his job. He sets it up in the Old North Church. Uses a man by the name of Robert Newman, who's a sexton in the Old North Church. Patriot congregation, Tory minister. Kind of a mess over there, but he gets in there. So that was to alert the other riders that this is where they're coming from. They're coming in Cambridge at Leechmere Point. That's where they're going. That's where we think they're coming out. So Revere didn't have to get on his horse to alert him for that. Warren had asked him. He said, you know, I'm begging you, could you please tell Adams and Hancock that we have forces out there, but and they're in danger of being taken. See, what had happened was the commander of the expedition in Gage, they had sent out an 8 to 10 man team to scout the area too. Revere wasn't the only one out there with his men riding that day. The British party was riding out there, led by a man by the name of Major Mitchell, who was a, I guess, lack of a better term, a real hellion. And we'll see what happens and why things unfold the way they do, because he's not the only one like that in the British Army that day. So he's riding out, and they think they're looking for Adams and Hancock. They're probably looking to see what the militia activity was, but there was no doubt they were probably looking for Adams and Hancock. I think it's pretty well understood, although there's some debate, you weren't going to send a 700 or 1,500 man detachment to look for 2 men. That just did not make much sense. But he did this, so Revere says, yes, I know the way, I know Clark, I'll go there and I'll find them. He also sends another man by the name of William Dawes, whose descendants ended up in Ohio. One of them became a Civil War general. Dawes is buried in Boston. Dawes' job was solely to alert Adams and Hancock. He had already sent him by another way. We think he may have been sent, we don't know. He was sent around the same time Paul had been sent. But, you know, Revere was working more as an equal to Warren at that point, although Warren was in charge. Dawes was pretty more, he did not have Revere status. His job was just to go under and get to the parsonage, which he does. His job is not to alarm the countryside, and that has ramifications that day too. Because one town doesn't get the alarm, and they said, well, what did Dawes do? He did his job. He wasn't supposed to sit there, he was supposed to get to Adams and Hancock, which he does just after Revere gets there. So they do that. They get there probably a little after midnight. And the town of Lexington had sent their men out. And there's some controversy, and that's another story for another day as to whether they had Minutemen there. I believe they did. They had a detachment of 10 men there. They must have got them from somewhere. They didn't say, okay, give me any 10 men. They probably picked their best men they could get to guard that house. So they do. So Revere warns Adams and Hancock. He says, no, there's another rider that's been sent. Do we know what happened to him? Because they were afraid he may have been captured. They said, no, we haven't seen him yet. About 10 minutes later, Dawes comes riding up. So he and Revere recognize each other. They all know each other. So they're happy he made it through. So now all of a sudden they have a problem. They know there's a British force split in two. 700 men under a man named Lieutenant Colonel Smith, combat veteran from the war in Portugal, and an overall command under a man named Lord Percy, another interesting story, with another 800 men who's the overall commander, but he's still in Boston waiting word from Smith. They're supposed to get word back to him, said, okay, let us know where you are so we can march out. Doesn't get the word for 2 hours because somebody fell asleep literally. So, at that point in time, they come out to the common, the green, and Jonas Clark, we believe Hancock and Adams went there too. One of the witnesses from the house said they did go there. And presumably Paul Revere and Dawes were there, and they were consulting as to what was going to happen. Lexington's a small town. Still is in a certain way. It's much bigger proportionally than it used to be, but it was 1,000 people. 130 men in their militia, in their train band. They actually called them a train band. And so, it's an old English term, for self-defense force. So he calls them out about 1:30. So all 103 men come out. Parker had sent out a couple of alarm riders and some spies too to see if they could find anybody. Nobody had come back. They couldn't quite see them where they were. A few men got captured. So he dismisses everybody. So they all go back. He tells about 40 or 50 of the men who don't live close by, because it's a long walk and a long ride. Why don't you just stay in the tavern? The rest of you men go home. So they do. Probably 2 o'clock this happens. 2.5 hours later, while Parker's still up, Adams and Hancock have to go. Hancock doesn't want to go. He wants to stay. He grew up part of his life in Lexington. He wanted to stay and fight with the militia. They said, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to help this situation. You need it. So after much pressure from everybody around him, he wants, very reluctantly, and he goes with Adams. And so the other men come back. Revere and a man by the name of James Lowell, who was the secretary to Hancock. Hancock had very important papers that needed to be scurried away, so they helped do that. So now we're getting around 4 o'clock, 4:30. About 4:30, a man named Thaddeus Bowman, one of the riders, comes back, alerts Parker that he had just seen those men. He said they're a half hour up Kings Highway, which is on Mass Avenue. And they're all, they are nervous at this point. Their cell phones are going off. They're falling asleep. They're wondering when this is going to end. And they're saying to themselves, my God, half hour? What's going on? A half hour? We're not going to be able to get all our men. Well, it was worse than that. It was like 15 or 20 minutes, and all of a sudden they could hear the drums and the fifes, and they could see the men coming in. They came in great array. Parker has probably from the tavern 30 or 40 men. They all rush into the green. Other men are coming in. One of the men that was there is from Woburn, a man named Sylvanus Wood. He actually did a count. He asked Parker if he could follow in with him, because there was activity in that early part of the morning from people from other towns, including a man from Greenfield, actually, believe it or not, which is like 2 hours that way. And they said, yeah, we could use you. They probably had 38 to 45 men on that green when the British started approaching it. Other men are coming on, though. So we weren't 77 men in a line, but many of them were coming onto the green when this happened. Now, for the absolutely astonishing portion of this. Colonel Smith had detached 300 of his forward men under the command of a Marine. There were 2 Marine brigades that day under John Pitcairn. And John Pitcairn was actually the ranking Marine in North America. You went as far as a colonel back then in the Marines. And he was a major. He was one of 2, I believe, at the time. And he had put a lieutenant of Marines in charge of the first 300 men. He was behind them. With Lieutenant Adair was Major Mitchell, who led the patrol. By the way, Paul Revere's ride ends because he and Dawes end up riding in the Concord. They meet a man named William Prescott, who was engaged to a Lydia Mulligan in town. He says, hey, we know who you are. You want to join us? Yeah, I'll help you guys out. They all ride. They run into Major Mitchell's party. They all get caught. Then they attempt to they all attempt to escape. They do. They grab Revere first. Dawes' horse throws him, so he's stuck in the woods. Prescott jumps over a fence and he makes it out. approaches Revere on his horse, takes out his pistol and claps it to his head. He said, "Who are you?" He says, "My name's Revere." And they all are astonished. They all know who he is. Paul Revere is very well known among the British detachment and what he's doing. And then for a man that has, and this was verified by the two British officers that were nearby that commented on this, he turns to Mitchell with a gun to his head and he says, "You know what? You could kill me at any point." He says, "I've already alarmed the countryside. There are 500 men. You're not going to make it out of here." Mitchell, for the first time that night, loses his nerve. Talks to his officers. They're going to be surrounded. They have 8 to 10 men. They're getting out. So what do? Well, Dawes kind of scares them away. He makes it sound like, I mean, they must have been easily fooled this night. He makes it sound like he has 100 men with him, so they don't go chasing him, but he's stuck in the woods because he doesn't have a horse. They switch horses with Revere, they cut the bridles, and they make him just kind of walk into town. So he and Dawes hook up again, and they come back to Lexington. That's when they first got out of muster. This Major Mitchell guy, I want to talk about another story. In Lincoln earlier that morning, he had come across a man by the name of Josiah Nelson. I think that was his first name. And he was the alarm man in Lincoln. He was the one who was supposed to knock on the doors to let everybody know that there was trouble afoot. Well, he comes out. The British officers are in dark cloaks. He says, "Hey, have you heard about the British patrol out?" One of the officers takes a saber, gashes him across the forehead and says, "Yeah, I'll show you where they are." Now, he doesn't kill him. Kind of leaves him on the ground. Well, he recovers himself, bandages himself up. So when he goes to alarm his neighbors, they said, "What's going on?" He says, "Just look at my head. One of them just sabered me." So that's what's going on that night. Back to the green. Lieutenant Adair marches his 300 men. He is joined by Major Mitchell. He is joined by a man named Lieutenant Sutherland, who shouldn't even be there. He ended up sneaking in because he wanted to be part of the detail. How he did this, I can't tell you. He did it. And he was another excitable fellow. Young man. These men are in their mid-20s. Never seen battle a day before in their lives, and they can't stand Americans. So I'll give you an idea of what the attitude is like. Truly it is. Where the Parker statue is on the green, I think everybody's seen it, was a 3-story meeting house, church. And in that church, that's where Pastor Clark had led his congregation. Mitchell, Sutherland, and Adair see the Minutemen scrambling to get on the green. They see a line of about 45 men. They claim they see 200. They don't have 200 men in the entire Lexington Company, but they claim they saw at least 200, 250 men. Adair's orders are to go on the left fork to Concord, where he should have gone if they wanted those guns. They weren't going to get them, but I mean, it would have given them, it wouldn't have been as bad for them as it turned out to be. Instead, he thinks he's a military marshal now. He veers off to the right, no doubt prodded on by his 2 compatriots. So now all of a sudden, 300 men are now facing maybe 40 to 55 men tops. Other men are coming on the green. Now, to give you an idea of the determination, you know you don't have a lot of men, and you're still rushing on the green to join your fellows on the green. That's how seriously they took this. Why did Parker do that? He didn't do it because he wanted to open fire on these guys. He didn't do it because he thought he was going to hold off 300 to 600, 700 men with even 130 if they were all there, which they weren't going to be. He did it because he wanted to make a statement. He says, "You guys have been through my town. We're not going to let you do anything. We're going to, you have to come back this way. So if you think you're going to get those guns, it's not going to happen." Well, now that Adair had taken that move, there was no way out. Those men were facing each other, nobody was moving. At this point, Parker turns around, orders his men to disperse. Understand what disperse means. It doesn't mean retreat. It doesn't mean, okay, we're wrong, we see the error of our ways. It doesn't mean we're surrendering our guns. It means we're going to break up and reform in the rear, which they wanted to do. Meanwhile, Major Pitcairn sees what his lieutenant did. He's riding up in a fury. He's angry because he knows they were supposed to go that way and they're going this way. So he gives orders to the militia to surrender. Now, the other 3 men had already done that in very coarse terms, so it wasn't really endearing themselves to the Minutemen themselves. At that point, 2 pistol shots ring out. The reason I say that, and I know nobody's ever, it's not true either, but you look at the records, you look at the depositions, Where the depositions agree, including on the British side, where there is something in sync, 2 pistol shots. Chances are it wasn't the British rank and file. They weren't going to fire without orders. It wasn't going to be the militias. You know, different kind of people in the 18th century than there are in the 21st century. All right? They believed in their word of God and their scriptures that seriously. They made a solemn covenant they weren't going to fire first, because you know why? They wouldn't have had to. Because if they weren't going to fire, nothing was going to happen, right?
Amen.
It wasn't going to happen. And the way the British were acting, they were probably going to do it. Well, the two officers we think probably did it were probably Major Mitchell and Lieutenant Sutherland. Because they weren't stopping, they weren't laying down their arms, they fired shots. Probably didn't hit anybody, we don't know. Well, then after they did that, the British rank and file opened up. 7 men from Lexington and 1 man from Woburn, not Savannah Wood, Ashabel Porter, had been captured that day. He tried to make a break for it with Elijah Sanderson from Lexington, or another man, Lexington. They were both shot while trying to escape, I guess you could put it. The other men on the green, 5 out of the remaining 6 of them, 6 out of 7 of them, had their backs to the opposing forces. They were not fighting them straight on. They were dispersing. Most of them had their backs. One, Jonas Parker, John Parker's cousin, turned around and fired back, for which he was bayoneted and clubbed and shot and killed. That's what happened in the Battle of Lexington. That's only the first part, though, folks. I see people tell about the story of Lexington. They say, okay, that's it. Oh, isn't that awful? All these men died. Oh, my God, they got overwhelmed. In the meantime, in between the shots being fired, Colonel Smith rides up, which is a chore. He's a corpulent man, but he's a competent officer, but he's not a brilliant one, but he's competent. He's looking at Adair. He's looking at Mitchell and Sutherland. He says, what did you just do? We're supposed to go that way. You just started a fight here. We have dead people on the, in front of Jonas Parker's church. He has 7 of his congregants and another man lying dead in front of the meeting house, or close enough to it. And then all of a sudden, we're supposed to go to Concord. And not only do those troops lose control, the troops behind Smith start rushing onto the green. And then they have to beat assembly. He yells at Sutherland, he says, get a drummer. Sutherland gets a drummer, and he's in enough trouble. They beat assembly, and they get people in order. They do 3 cheers, the British, who's that? Which did not endear them to the townspeople or the militia that saw them, or the trained band that saw them. They march off to Concord. Now, they get to Concord. Now understand, the only way back from Concord is to go back through Lexington. Okay? That will be part 2. But at Concord itself, they're in the town. The intelligence was great. Not only did they not be able to get very much in the way of ammunition, they were hidden, they were scurried away, they were buried. All they ended up with were 2 old caissons that they didn't ferret away. Apparently it wasn't a priority, and they started to burn them. Meanwhile, you have 500-600 militiamen from Concord, which is the center of Middlesex County at that point. It still holds sway to this day, but it was a big one at that point. And they're looking down on this, and they're saying, what is happening here? Are they burning the town? So they march down to the bridge. Well, there happened to be 100 men from the British side on that bridge. Another 90 had gone on a scurrying expedition. Nobody knows where they ended up yet. So they start marching down. And they're led by the Acton militia, the Acton Minutemen, Isaac Davis. The reason they were led by them is because they were trained in bayonets. Now, there were other bayonets around that day, but these men knew how to use them, and they volunteered to go. So they get to the bridge. All of a sudden, they get to the bridge, shots ring out from the British line. They fired first there, no doubt about it, which is why we also think they fired first in Lexington. There just seemed to be a pattern that day. They killed Davis, they killed his adjutant, Isaac Hosmer, and then all of a sudden, Joseph Hosmer, sorry, they returned fire. They hesitated. The reason they hesitated was that the first volley didn't do anything, the second volley they didn't see who it hit. And Buttrick said, for God's sake, fire. And they did, and they just took out the British line. Killed 3 men, wounded another 10, and then the British they didn't just disperse, they ran in a rout out of there. The other 90 men come running by after that, and they see what happened, and they get out of town. At this point, nobody wants to start a full-scale war, believe it or not. And at a place called Merriam Corner, again, they were kind of gauging each other. 2 British rear guard troops turned to fire at a couple of advancing American front guard units, and then it was on. It didn't stop. All of a sudden, they discovered, we better get out of here. This isn't good. But they're able to keep order. All of a sudden, no sooner do they cross the Lincoln-Lexington line, you heard a large thud, bang, bum. Colonel Smith gets off his horse. Pitcairn shot off his horse. 10 British soldiers are killed. A couple of officers and many others wounded. Parker's men had reformed with 127 remaining men he had. Almost stopped the column right there. They retreated. They killed a couple more Lexington men, including one that was wounded that day, and they reformed. And then they shot him again. And then there were more people from the Concord area pressing in on them. From that part, which is at the part of the park, when the park starts in Lexington, that's called Parker's Revenge, because that's where it happened. So when you get to the green, the British column almost collapsed. They almost surrendered. All of a sudden, when they get to the green, they hear another bang. Cannonball goes right through the meeting house. It was Lord Percy's relief column. Apparently Gage had been asleep, so when he got the dispatch back from Smith, it was like 2 hours later, Percy hurries up to get his men out. But he forgets, he brings his cannon, but he forgets to bring extra ammunition. So he's almost out of his ammunition. He saves the column. He thinks he's going to pick up where Smith left off. Okay, we're going to drive these guys back. We're going to complete the mission. Then they said, okay, we may not be able to complete the mission, but we're going to drive these guys off. A few minutes after that, okay, maybe we're not going to drive these guys off, but we're going to retreat in good order. Which he almost does. But he takes heavy losses, and then they have to retreat, which they do, till they get to Menotomy, which was part of Cambridge at that point. And at this point, I want to talk about the most interesting part of the day, because there was an old soldier that was out there, 80 years old, a guy named Samuel Whittimore. Samuel Whittimore had been a veteran of not just the Provincial Army, but the British Army itself, the English Army, during the Colonial Wars from the 1730s on. He retired in the 1760s. When it came to, he would appreciate that, when it came to the morning, he was too old, not just for the alarm list, but he was too old for the old man's list. So when he goes out, his family says, well, you know, we don't know if you should go out. He says, no, I don't know if you should go out. I'm going out. And what does he do? He takes his own post. He takes a post, anybody familiar with it, it's on Mass Ave, but it's right near the old Congregational Church site. And there's a monument to him. And he takes a post with young men. Some young militiamen are there. Presumably from Menotomy, but they could have been from other areas too. And all of a sudden you saw, I don't know, 6 to 8 grenadiers, the elite troops that day. They find a spot. He shoots 2 of them dead. They start rushing to position. A couple of the young guys get killed. A couple more leave. He tries to take care of them, actually, and he's there by himself. He kills another 1 or 2. Now they're on him. They had already shot him, chopped part of his face off. They clubbed him in the head. They bayoneted him. And with a saber, he still manages to wound, at least mortally, 1 or 2 more. They figured he had 4 to 5 kills that day. They brought in old Dr., well, not old Dr. Tufts at that point, but not the university man, but his nephew. This is the uncle. And they said, Doctor, what are we going to do with this man? He says, there's nothing else I can do for him. He's been shot, bayoneted, and eventually he's going to succumb. Well, he does, 18 years later. He lived to be 98. And they would ask him, well, they all knew the story. They said, how did you survive? I mean, do you have any lingering effects? Well, I have a slight limp. That's all he said. He had a slight limp. So that gives you an idea of the caliber of man that was out there that day. Eventually, Percy does lead the retreat back into Charlestown, and he's up at the Bunker Hill Heights for the first time they're fortified. Patriot forces really can't get there, but the British forces do not look back. There's just no way they can look back. And that's how the Battle of Lexington and Concord ended. There would be an 11-month siege almost in Boston. which will be relieved when General Washington and Henry Knox had gotten a cannon on Dorchester Heights. But that was the beginning of it. So, anybody have any questions?
That's a lot.
That's pretty cool.
That's the short version. You should hear the cell phones go off.
And let's give Rich 3 huzzahs. Hip hip! Huzzah! Hip hip! Huzzah! Hip hip! Huzzah!
We do that at Camp Constitution.
Thank you.
Ah, Rich.
Awesome.